Welcome back to our webinar. Advancing on, our next speaker, Mr. Andrew Owen Griffiths, is the head of a unit in Directorate General Santé, responsible for conducting audits on pesticides, organic and plant health, and also has policy responsibility for the sustainable use of pesticides. Within his responsibility falls the achievement of a reduction in pesticide use and risk as one of the objectives of the Farm to Fork strategy, and the review of the sustainable use of pesticides legislation. The principles of integrated pest management. Mr. Owen Griffiths, the floor is yours.
Okay, so hello and good afternoon, everybody. I'll start off by introducing myself. My name is Andrew Owen Griffiths. I work for DG Santé, DG Health and Food Safety, where I'm the head of the unit responsible for carrying out audits and evaluations on a range of issues, including organic farming, plant health and pesticides. I'm also responsible for the Sustainable Use Directive, and obviously in the context of this discussion on sustainable foodstuffs and the Farm to Fork, there is a significant impact here because the Sustainable Use Directive aims for the sustainable use of pesticides. And there are a number of actions announced under the Farm to Fork, including the targets pertaining to pesticides and the review of the Sustainable Use Directive that are specific actions mentioned. Now, I want to start by I understand you've had previous presentations that will have touched on the European Green Deal and the Farm to Fork, but just to set the scene very quickly, the European Green Deal announced under the von der Leyen presidency includes a number of different areas or activities. One of these is the Farm to Fork strategy, launched in May 2020. And the aim of the strategy, the overall goals, are to support a transition to competitive food. And by food, we're looking at the whole food chain, so from farm to fork. So not only production of food, but consumers and food processing, the whole chain. You might ask what a sustainable food system is. This slide here gives you a definition of what we understand by a sustainable food system. So what we're aiming to achieve by a sustainable food system. You'll notice it also includes ensuring and maintaining food safety and public health, which are not for compromise, but also to preserve the affordability of food and to understand the economic aspects of producing sustainable and safe food. The Farm to Fork strategy was published alongside a number of stated actions. You've already had presentations, I think, on the Water Framework Directive, and you've had a presentation from DG Agri on CAP strategic plans. So one of the actions which is very important is the 9 objectives of the Common Agricultural Policy, where the Commission will support Member States through the CAP strategic plans, national strategic plans, to meet the objectives of the Farm to Fork. Of most interest here is the revision of the Sustainable Use of Pesticides Directive, which will bring us on to the issue of enhancement of integrated pest management. Also complementary to that, the increase in organic farming. The organic farming sector is complementary, as are issues regarding fertiliser use, but I'm not going to go into detail on those. The strategy also includes a number of targets, and these are listed here. And one of those is where the Sustainable Use Directive is directly applicable, is to reduce by 50% the overall use and risk of chemical pesticides, and specifically to reduce the use by 50% total of the more hazardous pesticides, what we call the candidates for substitution. Obviously, the other targets, in particular the fourfold increase in organic farming area, or nearly fourfold increase in organic farming area to 25%, is complementary because it should also affect the pesticide reduction. I ought to stress these targets, which are announced, are not in legislation. They're not legally binding. They are aspirational targets. as part of where we want to go with the farm to fork strategy. And obviously we hope that all stakeholders, that member states and industry will buy into these targets as well. Consideration may be given at a later stage to including these in legislation to have them applicable as a legal requirement, but at the moment they are aspirational and forward-looking targets that set the direction we want to move in. So focusing on pesticides, the first target, this 50% reduction in use and risk, is based on an existing indicator. So the methodology and the data sets are strong. We have data from 2011 on sales of pesticides, and that's what this is based upon. Because there are different qualities for pesticides, some are relatively low risk, some are higher, we then categorize all the active substances into groups, and we weight the different groups. So the obvious idea here is that it's better to use lower risk pesticides than higher risk pesticides. So as well as encouraging an overall reduction, we're trying to ensure that doesn't lead in the sales and the use of more hazardous substances. This next slide then just explains in more detail those different categories and that categorization. As I said, it's based on an indicator that exists. So we have data from 2011. So this is called Harmonized Risk Indicator 1. Now, obviously, the target that we've been talking about for 2030 is from a starting point of 2017, so data from 2017. But historically, we can see that over this period of 2011 to 2018, we have a 17% reduction. So we're going in the right direction, but obviously to reach a 50% reduction by 2030, between 2017 and 2030, that graph's going to have to go down more rapidly and consistently throughout that period. The second target is specifically looking at the sales of candidates for substitution, the more hazardous substances that we anticipate should be removed or substituted by other substances. Now, in the period of 2011 to 2018, the sales of these categories of substances was flat. There was no reduction in the sales volumes of these substances, and clearly the legislation and the driver is that to meet the target, the HRI1 target, the overall target, we're going to have to see a substantial reduction in these candidates for substitution. So we're giving a message here that priority needs to be given to remove these from the market or to find alternatives for them. So how are we going to achieve these targets? Well, I think the first thing to say is there's no one answer to that question. We need an approach by all actors, by the Commission, we'll do our part, by our politicians, by member states, by industry, by stakeholders, and by farmers. The key thing that we think needs to be done, there will be some reduction because of the removal of harmful chemicals from the market, but the key thing that we need is to increase the implementation of IPM. So chemical pesticides can be used, but as a last resort is the basic principle we're looking at here. With IPM, it's in legislation, it's clear what IPM is. But we don't have good enforcement and implementation of IPM. We believe there's greater potential for broader use and more systematic use of IPM. We've seen some very good examples of IPM use, but we don't see it systematically used or applied. To support that, we will also need an increased availability of lower risk alternatives, what we call a farmer's toolbox, to give them the choice to choose lower risk substances. And we could also look at the incentivization through the Common Agricultural Policy. As mentioned, another driver will need to be the reduced sales of candidates for substitution, and this will be a priority for research and for member state action to remove these from the market. And we also expect that the shift to organic farming should also result in a decrease in the use of chemical substances. I don't want to go into detail on legislation, but this is the legal requirement in the Sustainable Use Directive at the moment on the principles of of IPM, so promoting low pesticide input pest control, to have the information and tools available to allow users of pesticides to be able to apply IPM. Member states should explain in their national action plans how IPM is applied, and then member states should ensure that all professional users implement IPM principles. Integrated pest management, or IPM, doesn't say we can't use chemicals. It says that we favour the prevention of the use of pesticides. We look at all steps necessary before pesticides are used, and if we have to use substances, we prioritise non-chemical methods and lower risk pesticides. In the directive, and I'm not going to go through this in huge detail, there are 8 principles of IPM, and these are explained in detail if you want to look at the annex to the directive. But in essence, the first principle is that we look at all tools available to prevent pests in the first place so that we don't need the intervention. There's a range of actions here that can implement. This could be soil quality, it could be agricultural methods, it could be the use of environmental measures, it could be the use of competitive varieties, resistant varieties, crop rotation, other agricultural practices. We then should monitor for the specific pests that are threatening the crop, and only when we reach a specific and defined threshold for the presence of the pest do we then look at interventions. The interventions, we should prioritise first of all non-chemical interventions, so biological controls, physical interventions, agricultural practices to reduce the pests. And then if we have to provide and apply a pesticide, we're applying as specific as possible a pesticide so it only affects the one pest that we're interested in, and that we apply mitigating measures to ensure that the pesticide is applied at lower levels, low drift nozzles, for example, targeted application, and making sure the dose rate's correct. And having done that, we then look at making sure there's no resistance to pesticide by monitoring and closing that loop, so making sure that the application has worked. One of the problems we have is that the legislation doesn't require farmers to keep a record of how they've applied these principles, so it's very difficult for member states to check. Member states can check that pesticides have been applied, the requirements under 1107 for pesticide application records, but it's very difficult to check how people have not applied pesticides, how they've used the IPM principles, because there's no requirement for them to be recorded. So this is where we are. We are currently revising the Sustainable Use Directive. We're at the early stage. We've just done the impact assessment for the inception and started the evaluation. We've been through feedback. We had 360 comments through the feedback. We welcome further comments on the basic principles of the revision of the Sustainable Use Directive. We will start with an external evaluation later this year. There's various things will be considered in this review. At the moment, they're all open, but one of the possible considerations is possible allocation of reduction, the targets that we've already talked about amongst member states. There's a lot of work going on with the new CAP and CAP strategic plans, but I understand Niall Gillitz gave you a presentation on this yesterday, so I won't repeat myself. And that's me finished. Obviously, if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Owen Griffiths, for this fantastic presentation and overview. I'm sure we have a lot of questions. Nenad, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Wouter. First of the questions is how will the training and transfer of knowledge to the farmer be approached? Are state programs planned in the budget, or will it be left in the hands of private sector to implement?
Okay, so I hope you can hear me well. Obviously, any research or any policy decision needs to be transferred to the farmer. So the dissemination of information is crucial, and member states have the responsibility here to ensure that independent advice is available to farmers to make decisions regarding the implementation of IPM. It's an obligation that the farm advisory system that's in a member state, the people are trained and have knowledge on IPM, and they should be able to give independent advice to farmers on IPM. So this is the knowledge transfer. A number of member states also have very significant networks of demonstration farms, and this is something we really encourage, because this peer exchange is something that farmers really need to be able to understand the practical applications rather than the scientific applications. So some member states have very good networks of demonstration farms. France, for example.
Okay, thank you. The next question, will there be incentives in plan for the farmers to switch to some of the alternative techniques of pest management, as the implementation could otherwise encounter resistance from those involved?
Well, this is the incentive is under the Common Agricultural Policy, and this is really the presentation I understood was given by Niall Gurlitz earlier, where I'm sure he talked about IPM and the conditionality, so parts of the IPM principles which have to be applied, and also the use of eco schemes and additional measures where member states can go beyond the legal requirements and promote and incentivize additional measures. So that's the tool that's available. And at the moment, member states are supposed to be writing in to their national strategic plans the strategy that they will follow to achieve this, and which tools available under the CAP that they will use. So the Commission and Mr. Gurlitz are currently in heavy negotiation and discussion with member states, and I'm not fully party with the exact discussions, but that's the basic principle that we're following.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Another question just came up. Yesterday, we heard how slow it takes to approve, register biological control products. What measures will be put into place to expedite the process? Okay.
Well, I didn't go into detail on that. It's not my area of responsibility. It's another person within the Commission, within DG Sante. But one of the stated actions within the Farm to Fork is to increase the speed of putting lower risk substances on the market. So this would include lower risk chemical substances, microbials, biological controls. And we really, one of the things that's been worked on is to increase the weight on the approval system to make sure that the number of low risk substances, chemical and non-chemical, is increasing. Now they are increasing, they need to increase further. And there is there's a specific working group with member states to discuss the approval of such substances.
Thank you. We have an additional question, but I don't think that we will make it in time. And now we will switch it to the last session at the end of the last lecture. Therefore, Wouter, back to you.
Thank you so much, Nina. Let's indeed introduce directly our last speaker, Mrs. Underwood.
The last speaker of our webinar is Ms. Evelyn Underwood, a senior policy analyst in the biodiversity program of the Institute for European Environmental Policy, IEEP. Ms. Underwood has 9 years' experience with European biodiversity policy work and biodiversity conservation issues, particularly in agriculture and forestry. Her areas of expertise include pollinator conservation, reducing impacts of pesticides on biodiversity through sustainable use, policies to reduce impacts of invasive alien species on biodiversity, and sustainable forest management for biodiversity. Before joining IEEP, Evelyn worked for 8 years at the Swiss Institute of Technology on an international development project to strengthen the environmental risk assessment of genetically modified crops. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, review of the EU Pollinators Initiative. I give the word to Ms. Underwood.
Hello everyone, my name is Evelyn Underwood and I work in the Institute for European Environmental Policy. We're an independent not-for-profit think tank focused on EU environmental policy, and in the IEP Biodiversity Programme we currently have a support contract for the European Commission for the EU Pollinators Initiative. So most of what I will say to you today comes from that project work. In my talk today, I'll first give you a little introduction to pollinators, then to the EU Pollinators Initiative, with some examples of the many actions going on in the EU and member states, and then I'll finish with a description of an analysis I'm working on right now on the sustainable use of pesticides national action plans and what they can do for pollinator conservation. Now, you're all in the business of producing fruit, or at least interested in it, so I can guess a lot of you know all about pollinators. I'll be brief just to refresh your memories, but I've included information and sources on my slides so that those of you who wish can dig deeper afterwards. And I'm very interested to hear from you all and your experiences, so my plan is to leave plenty of time for questions and discussion after I've finished speaking. I hope that you'll be busy thinking of questions and comments whilst I talk. To start with, what are pollinators? As you know, a pollinator can be any animal that moves between the flowers carrying pollen from one flower to the other. But here I'd just like to point to the diversity of pollinating insects. It's not true that the honeybee is the most important or efficient pollinator, though of course when a set of hives are placed in an orchard, the sheer number of bees tends to dominate the flower visitors. However, for apples and pears, for example, the solitary bees called osmia, or mason bees in English, are actually more effective pollinators. Bumblebees are the only ones who can reach inside most legume flowers, so they are the only effective pollinators of peas and beans, clover and alfalfa, for example. On oilseed rape, hoverflies are helpful pollinators, and they are also likely to be important pollinators of other open-flowered crops, simply because they're very abundant and everywhere, and this is partly because the most common species are less bound to semi-natural habitats than our solitary bees. And we shouldn't forget that hairy flies, wasps, moths and butterflies, and some hairy beetles are also pollinators, and this tends to get ignored because little is known about their importance for commercial crops. So why are pollinators important for crops? Pollination is of course essential to fruit yield in some varieties, but it can also stimulate fruit yield in varieties that are not completely dependent on insect pollination, for example by increasing the oil content in oilseed rape. But also important is its effect on fruit quality. Increases the nutrient content, for example, improves the shelf life of strawberries. And the diversity of pollinators is important for crop pollination. A study showed that when there are more wild pollinators, there's more pollination even when honeybees are present in cropping systems across the globe. And when there's a greater diversity of pollinators, there's more pollination than when only a few species are present. Different species do different things. They behave differently, they fly to different places in the orchard and at different times of the year and day. Solitary bees are more likely to fly across the rows in an orchard, whereas honeybees tend to go systematically from one tree to the next down the row. And this might not be what you need to get pollination across your trees. And why are pollinators important for nature? It's important to remember that pollinator conservation is not just about producing more and better fruit. Over 3/4 of our wild plant species depend on insect pollination, and these are the basis for our natural and semi-natural habitats, supporting the rest of the food web and lots of other ecosystem services. So, what is the problem with our pollinator populations? Studies have shown a dramatic decline in the species richness and abundance of wild pollinators in some parts of Europe, notably in the UK, Germany and the Netherlands, where there's good monitoring data, particularly on the wild bees and butterflies. But there's evidence at the global level too of the loss of species diversity. This graph is from records made by experts in the global GBIF database. So I think across the EU we can say that there are worrying signs. At the same time, experts can't currently conclusively say how big the problem is everywhere, because we just don't know. The EU Red List of Bees, published in 2017, found only 9% of Europe's 2,000 or so bee species to be threatened. But actually, the experts couldn't assess the status of over half of Europe's bee species. So it could be that 60% of them are in danger. The Netherlands, for example, found that over half of its bee species are threatened, and they know about all of their species. There's also some evidence that fruit production in the EU is suffering from pollination deficits at the moment. What about the honeybees? In contrast, the number of honeybees seems to be increasing globally and remaining pretty constant in the EU, at least according to these FAO statistics of numbers of hives. This doesn't, of course, take account of differing trends in particular regions or countries. What's driving this decline of pollinators? There's no one answer, as pollinators are under pressure from a combination of stressors. Top of the list is the loss of wild flowers in our landscapes, which is why cities with their gardens sometimes have more pollinators than the surrounding agricultural land, though air pollution and light pollution are also stressors. It's also possible that wild bees are being affected by some of the diseases and pests that plague our honeybees, though not, of course, the varroa mite, which is specialised on honeybees. And honeybees can compete with wild bees for food in some situations. Climate change is having a big effect too, but this is benefiting some species whilst putting others under more pressure, notably bumblebees in southern Europe. But clearly one of the main drivers of decline in Europe is agricultural intensification and all that comes with it. This picture shows the progressive simplification and intensification of an agricultural landscape and the way this affects the diversity of wildlife by removing food in the form of flowers and shelter as nesting and hibernating habitats, by intensively cutting and fertilizing grasslands, fewer weeds and flowering shrubs, fewer and flower-poor field margins, and no other spare spaces in our agricultural landscapes, the edges, the corners that used to get just left, and of course by increasing fertilizer and pesticide use. And pesticide residues in soil and water can have long-term impacts and spread quite far away from the fields, as being increasingly shown, and of course as we have learned from the neonicotinoids. So what's the EU doing to respond to this situation? The EU Pollinators Initiative was launched by the Commission in 2018 after the International Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services published its influential report on pollinators and pollination. The initiative lists strategic objectives and actions for the EU and its member states to address the decline of wild pollinating insects, and it's focused on 3 priority areas: improving knowledge of pollinator decline, its causes and consequences, tackling the causes of pollinator decline, and, very importantly, of course, raising awareness, engaging society at large, and promoting collaboration. Businesses are being invited to collaborate and share good practices in the Business and Biodiversity platform that DG Environment runs. I had a quick look, but I couldn't see any fruit juice organisations there, so I don't know if any of you in the audience are part of that platform already, so I'd be very interested to hear. I can't present to you all the things that are going on in the initiative, so I invite you to check out the EU Pollinator Information Hive, which is growing by the day. And I'll just give you in the next slide 3 examples of actions, hopefully to initiate some discussion after I stop talking. Firstly, to improve knowledge, a very important question is how we can find out about the situation and trend in our pollinator populations. The Commission has therefore funded 2 initiatives to roll out monitoring schemes across the EU. The first is based on the already successful butterfly monitoring schemes that rely on volunteers walking a standard transect and observing butterflies. You can see from the map that the project is concentrating on building up schemes in countries where there are lots of butterflies but no schemes yet, such as Italy and Bulgaria. Schemes are already working in the Netherlands, Germany, Switzerland and the UK, and I think perhaps some other places too. Now, the European Pollinator Monitoring Scheme ambition is larger. This is to establish a network of sampling sites across the EU to monitor wild bees and hoverflies as well as butterflies. It's not yet official because it's still being developed by experts, so you won't find it by Googling, but it will be announced very soon. It will use a combination of the transect method for the butterflies and the bumblebees and pan traps to measure solitary bees and hoverflies. To tackle the causes of decline and at the same time promote cooperation, at IEP we're working right now on guidance for farmers on what they can do for wild pollinators. The aim is to encourage awareness of the benefits that pollinators bring to farms, the things farmers can do on their farm, including recognising and protecting the habitats they already have and taking a whole farm approach. So sometimes it's not so much about creating new, it's about recognising that those messy corners, those bits of soil on the banks are actually important bee habitats and don't need to be tidied up. A key part of protecting insects is to stop the use of broad-spectrum insecticides and fungicides that are toxic to pollinators And that means taking an integrated pest management approach. So an important thing to get right is to have your flowering ground cover and flowering strips, whether you sow them or you naturally grow them, equally attractive to natural enemies of your crop pests and your wild pollinators. Hoverflies, for example, may do both these things for you. They'll eat aphids as larvae and they'll pollinate flowers as adults. On the slide, you can see the orchard on the left has got nettles in its in between rows, and this is specifically designed to shelter anthracorid bugs, which are the main predators of the pest that's causing most problems in this orchard. Earlier, you heard about the EU Common Agricultural Policy support measures. One is the EIP Agri Innovation Funding, and this has allowed wild pollinator-focused pilot projects to get going in several member states. I'll just point out the two in Slovenia and Portugal, which are targeted at fruit growers. The Slovenia project has just released a set of videos on YouTube highlighting the importance of solitary bees for fruit growing and what orchard managers can do for them. So check that out. I'll put the link in the slide. The Commission has also recently funded a set of pilot projects of the results-based payments approach to agri-environment schemes, and two of these included pollinators, one on permanent crops in Navarra, Spain, and one on pollinator margins on arable land in England. And on the DG Environment website, you'll find detailed reports, guidance, the tools that they've developed for the farmers involved, and the contacts for each of the schemes in case you want to find out more. Also, the Interreg Fund, part of the European Fund for Regional Development, has supported some interesting projects across borders taking action for wild pollinators. On the map, you can see just a sample, as I'm sure there's more going on. These projects could provide you with inspiration and guidance. For example, a common issue they're working on is how to increase access to species-rich and locally adapted seed mixes for sowing new grasslands or diversifying existing ones. And of course, there are many innovative LIFE projects, including, for example, right now, the LIFE Food and Biodiversity Project, which is collaborating with the EU Business and Biodiversity Platform. An issue we are working on right now at IEP is looking at member states' national action plans on the sustainable use of pesticides to see what they're delivering for the protection of wild pollinators and what good practices could be included in future national action plans. The Sustainable Use of Pesticides Directive gives lots of scope for action that can be targeted at protecting wild pollinators and, of course, other biodiversity, including natural enemies of crop pests. We identified 7 types of actions member states could programme in their plans based on the different articles in the directive. Member states could set quantitative objectives, targets, measures, timetables to reduce the risks and impacts of pesticide use on pollinators. For example, the Swedish National Action Plan states the objective to limit the use of plant protection products which are harmful to pollinating insects to minimise the risks by 2022. Member states can identify and target monitoring at priority active substances at crops, regions or practices. Now, this requires knowledge of what you're targeting. So, for example, the Swedish Board of Agriculture and the Swedish Chemicals Agency are currently working on developing an up-to-date list of all the plant protection products which are known to be harmful to pollinating insects. So that's not just honeybees. Finland realised it didn't have enough knowledge, so the Ministry of the Environment is funding a 2-year study analysing exposure of pollinators to pesticides that kicked off last year. Those member states that have already developed pollinator strategies can ensure policy coherence by cross-referring to national or regional strategies or action plans for pollinators. The new French Ecophyta plan is an example because it cross-links to the French national strategy for wild pollinators. Member states can control the impacts of pesticides on pollinators by specifying technology, training, spray rules, labelling of pesticides, and so on. An example for this, Belgium has set the target that all pesticide application equipment used in field and orchard spraying must have low drift nozzles by 2022. A big pillar of the Sustainable Use of Pesticides Directive is, of course, training and awareness raising. And this can include awareness of the risks to wild pollinators and how to minimise them, so that all professionals, sprayers, for example, who have to return to their training every year will become aware. Another big part of the directive is about promoting IPM, integrated pest management, and organic farming too as a complementary approach. The directive also allows for legislation to protect sensitive areas, including the Natura 2000 network. Spain has developed a comprehensive set of IPM guidelines for different crop systems and also, for example, forestry. And these are now mandatory for farmers in Natura 2000 sites. As I'm sure you're aware, the EU Green Deal, including the EU Biodiversity Strategy 2030 and the Farm to Fork Strategy, now sets some ambitious policy targets for agriculture and biodiversity, including the quantified pesticide use and risk reduction target. This means also a much sharper focus on the Sustainable Use of Pesticides Directive, as I think you heard from the previous speaker. DG Sante are currently evaluating the Sustainable Use of Pesticides Directive, starting with a public consultation later this year. And the EU Biodiversity Strategy announced the launch of the second phase of the EU Pollinators Initiative, which will probably come in 2022. So all in all, wild pollinators are an increasing focus of policy attention in the EU. And I'd encourage you to get engaged, to look at the EU Pollinators Information Hive, which will increase in the amount of information it has over the next year, and also the EU Business and Biodiversity Platform. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Ms. Underwood, for this very interesting presentation, and I'm sure we have a lot of questions. And it's our last question and answer possibility, so Nenad, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Wouter. Once again, we have a lot of questions. The first one, is there a particular type of pesticides that have higher impact on the decrease of pollinators? For example, fungicides versus pesticides?
Insecticides are obviously the most directly damaging, but I would caution from drawing conclusions about broad groups, because it depends very much on the active substance. And also, we shouldn't forget the impact of herbicides. Now, herbicides might not be directly toxic to pollinators, but they are removing the food source for the pollinators. And fungicides are a group that have been neglected, so there's actually very little information on the toxicity of fungicides to wild pollinators. And there's some evidence that there's this synergistic effect between certain fungicides and certain insecticides, which makes the toxicity of the insecticides much higher than it would be if the fungicide wasn't applied at the same time. I can give a more detailed list by email if you contact me.
Okay. The second question would be, if by 2022 nozzle applications of pesticides need to be modified, why not approve before the use of drones in the SUPD, which will apply accurately pesticides?
So I'm not an expert on the new drone technology. So I understand that there are probably a lot of details that I'm not aware of. But I would wonder whether drones will really significantly reduce pesticide drift compared to the spray technology that you're replacing. So it's not necessarily assumed that because you're using a drone, you're actually reducing the amount of pesticide that's reaching the crop and then that's being drifted off in the air and in the soil. What drones might allow is a more precise application of pesticides when they're actually needed, which will avoid you applying pesticides in a prophylactic way before you really, you think there might be a problem coming, but there's not actually evidence that this application is needed right now. But for that, of course, the drones we need to have a lot of drones, and the technology needs to be available at the right time. So one of the barriers, for example, in arable farming is that the farmers don't always have access to the spray equipment when they might need it. So they're actually applying the pesticides on a calendar basis, rather than a need basis.
Okay. And one additional question, are there any incentives planned for the farmers if they, for example, maintain a wide pollinators habitat, for example, meadows, wild meadows or similar?
So this goes back, I would say, for the publicly funded incentives, this goes back to the agri-environment schemes, particularly because they're the ones that are actually funding the flowering margins or the maintenance of a hay meadow that's full of flowers. That's one of the best wild bee habitats you can get. Greening had a certain effect in a few places because it encouraged more fallow, which was then either sown with species mixes that were attracted to bees, or it grew spontaneous weed vegetation. But actually very few farmers did do that. I mean, there are a few hot spots of, particularly when farmers were, their awareness was raised through other things. And then they just, oh yes, I can use my EFA for this. And there are a lot of other things going on, of course. It's not just CAP funding driving this. So some farmers are taking action themselves, and there are also examples of private businesses that are incentivizing their suppliers to take action for wild pollinators, raising awareness. Local authorities also taking action. So on the EU Pollinators Information Hive, one of the things that is already available there are sort of fiches on each of the countries in the EU, and short descriptions of different actions that are going on, including the private sector as well. So I'd encourage you to check that out. And we're always looking for better and newer examples to add to that information.
Okay, thank you, Mrs. Underwood. We will now enter the last phase of the Q&A, where you can put the questions to all of the speakers. So therefore, please use the Slido app for this matter, and all of the speakers can answer the questions. Okay, we have the first question. Chlorates are banned in the EU. However, according to the EC 2020-749, each MS should find a way to monitor it in the food, but how? Can any of the speakers relate to the question?
I can try. I'm not sure I'm the best person, but I don't think the best person's here. But my understanding of what you're saying is that there's a pesticide that's banned in Europe, but because it's a concern, we still target the monitoring of that pesticide in foodstuffs, and that's a common situation where a pesticide is removed from the market in Europe because we want to ensure that it's not being used in Europe, but also therefore we will look at products coming from outside of Europe that are imported to try and ensure that the residues aren't being found in products from abroad. So it's quite common when a substance is removed that it's targeted then for monitoring under the EFSA coordinated monitoring plan in foodstuffs.
Okay. Thank you. I'll just check if we have any additional questions here. Let us leave an additional few seconds if any of the questions come up too.
And of course, if anyone is not satisfied with the answer they receive, they should ask again.
Of course. Okay, last chance to put your questions in.
Maybe I could just add an answer to a question that was asked to another colleague then about drone application, because it's a requirement in the Sustainable Use Directive, and it's something that I know about. So if you allow me just to quickly answer on drone application. So a decision was made that drone application of pesticides, so not using drones for scanning crops or for identifying pest damage, but to actually physically apply pesticides is classed as aerial spraying and should not be done unless it's derogated for and approved by the competent authority in a member state. Now, the reason for this is we don't have any information that drone spraying is any safer and has lower drift than aerial spraying. So unless we get information to the contrary, and we've asked member states to provide this, which we'll consider for the review of the Sustainable Use Directive, we don't want it. We don't want to stop it. We want it to be controlled by member states. So at the moment, if you want to use aerial application, whether it's drone or otherwise, you can only do it in certain circumstances when it's approved by a competent authority and monitored. So aerial spraying comes under that. We would, though, encourage the use of technology to reduce pesticide needs. So for identifying areas of drought stress or areas of pest damage, to identify where pesticide application is needed, but not for the actual application of the pesticide itself.
Thank you, Mr. Owen Griffiths. It seems that we don't have any additional questions. Therefore, I would like to give our thanks to all of the speakers for sharing their expertise on these really interesting topics, which round about this significant change that we are all going to experience with the implementation of Farm to Fork strategy. We hope that their presentations, but also the dynamic Q&A sessions, have been able to provide you with the answers for your questions. And as mentioned before, all of the unanswered ones, or if you think that some of the questions were unanswered, please provide them to us. We will send them to the speakers individually, of course. And you will get your reply via email. And therefore, we thank you for taking the time to stay with us during the 2-day sessions. And we would also like to make notion of the following events that will take place in the next period. The SGF IFU Roadshow Asia on 7th of October, IFU Technical Webinar on 15th of October, and a Bears Academy Quality Management Year Conference on 5th of November. For more actual info, please find it on the pages of AIJN, the AIJN.eu, and SGF International, the SGF.org. Once again, we thank you for your attention and wish you a nice rest of the day.
Thank you so much, Nenad. Also, I would like to extend my thanks to all speakers of the last 2 days for their very valuable insights on all topics that have been addressed in these 2 days. Also, thanks to all participants to have stayed with us. And as said, we will have the 2 recordings of the 2 days on our website soon available. Also, thanks to our moderator of today, Nenad, thank you so much, and our partner SGF International. And finally, a thank to the company De Firma for providing the technology for this webinar. Wishing you all a fantastic day.